Previously on Staggerly's Man Cave. I've taken on the challenge of recreating a classic, forging my blade as well as all my fittings from stainless steel golf clubs, and I'm having to try some things I've never attempted. Have I bitten off more than I can chew, or could this end up being my best golf club knife yet? Welcome back for part 2 of recreating a Buck Vanguard from a golf club. Here I am prepping the pommel assembly for attachment by first marking with a center punch, then drilling a hole in the largest piece on the drill press. I of course checked reference in my tap and die set to match the hole size and threads appropriately for the stainless screw that we set up on the tang. For the thinner piece, I clamped it against the thick piece and used the first hole as a guide, since thin pieces like this aren't very easy to set level in a drill press vise. And with that done, I carefully cut threads into both pieces. Now we're going to see how it all fits together, and if you recall, I said earlier it was a nice feature that the screw pivots up and down, because as you see here it quickly accommodates into perfect position to match the pommel pieces to the pitch of the handle. This eliminated so much guesswork and made for a nice flush fit where micarta meets metal. It's time to heat treat the blade, and since the brass pin would never survive this part, we're going to temporarily undo it, which as you can see is no problem. Now here I'm wedging a little piece of cotton cloth into the tang, and the reason for this is the cloth will burn within the foil wrap we're about to make, consuming oxygen and preventing scale formation. Most people try to put this somewhere inconspicuous, as it does cause a bit of discoloring wherever it sits. Yep, I did it. Got me a $70 roll of stainless foil, but I must say it's pretty awesome. So pricey or not, you should avoid the temptation to be stingy here. As you can see, I measure about 4 times the knife width, so I can easily form an envelope that can be double folded along each seam. Please be extremely careful with this stuff. I'm proud to say I haven't cut myself with it yet, but I've seen some horrifying pictures on Instagram. So, knife goes in like so, double fold each seam, flattening each fold with a mallet, and when that's done, I like to force a little more air out by tamping down all the dead space around the knife, being cautious of course not to get too rough and perforate it around the pointy parts. This is also helpful to reveal the outline of the blade, as it's important to know which end is which and which edge is which during the heat treat and quench. So while I was splurging on foil, I figured why not go all out and get some huge aluminum blocks for plate quenching. Here I'm just practicing so I don't screw it up in the moment. I've done a lot of practice drawing a concealed weapon, so I guess I've got this ingrained mindset of being prepared when you only have one shot at something. Since only about 15 minutes passed between plate quenching and cryo, I go ahead and have this set up ahead of time. So for the deep chill slurry, I pour about an inch of acetone into this pot, then place it in a cooler which I've pre-chilled with normal ice, so we don't rob too much cooling power from the dry ice. As you guys know, I love my anthracite coal, so here I am setting up my usual 1 cubic foot coal bed, and look at me, I've gone digital. That's about as high-tech as I'm going to get, I imagine, but hey, for only $50, this is a great way to know what you're getting out of your heat source, however primitive it may be. So as you just saw, I began heat soaking the blade once I got around 1400, and you don't see it, but I did dig a little trough and place the blade in it, spine up, cutting edge down, once I hit 1900. That's where things got really interesting, because for the remaining duration of the heat treat, about 30 minutes that is, my oven effortlessly remained between 1900 and 2100 Fahrenheit, which is pretty much exactly the range you want for a stainless heat treat, and I was pleased to say the least. If you notice, as I pull the blade for the quench, the stainless foil has just begun to come apart. Believe it or not, this is exactly what you should expect from this self-sacrificing decarb shield. If it's not tattered and melty, you're doing something wrong. So as you can see, the plate quench went very smooth thanks to all the practice. I apply extra pressure with the vise, and as the aluminum rapidly moves heat out of the blade, I accelerate this process by applying compressed air everywhere I can get it. If you spend enough time on knife making forums, they can have you thinking you're going to blow your house up if you do something wrong with acetone and dry ice. They're like, no, add the dry ice to the acetone, and the other folks are like, no, add acetone to dry ice. Here's the truth of it with video proof. Whichever you add to which, in whichever order you do it, just do it gradually. As you can see, here I'm adding dry ice to an awaiting pool of acetone, and if you just wait for the first few chunks to simmer down before adding more, giving the solution time to acclimate, you'll have no problem. When the solution no longer reacts to additional dry ice, you can be confident in adding as much as you want as quickly as you want. The aluminum blocks work quickly, and it really only takes about 10 to 15 minutes for the blade to cool down enough to handle comfortably. Once that's the case, it's time to place it in the deep chill slurry of dry ice and acetone, which we often refer to this step casually as cryo, but to truly be cryo it has to be something more like liquid nitrogen, which chills to -300 Fahrenheit. Dry ice goes down to -109, which is still very effective. In fact, according to a scholarly article by Knife Steel Nerds, dry ice is almost equally effective as liquid nitrogen at converting unstable austenite to martensite and further hardening the steel. I've seen people do this step for an hour, and I've seen them go all night. I went with all night, as there's no such thing as going too long. Next up is the easy step of tempering. For this, I simply bake the knife at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, allow to cool down slowly, and repeat. This keeps the knife from being too brittle while still retaining the good hardness qualities achieved by the previous steps. Speaking of hardness, I must admit I was very pleased when it came time to test our HRC. As you'll see here, the first file to bite down was the HRC 65, making the HRC an estimated 61 to 62. I find it hard to believe that 431 could achieve anything over 60, but the carbon contents referenced in Part 1 come with a disclaimer that they can vary. All I can say is this particular golf club must have had a delightfully high carbon content, and that plate quenching and deep chill are popular for a reason. Now I'm coating the blade in layout fluid and using a drill bit of equal thickness to scribe a center line down the belly. So if you're wondering why I waited until after heat treatment to grind any bevels, the reason is due to the plate quenching. When the red hot blade is sandwiched between the plates, there needs to be as much surface area as possible making contact with them, to conductively transfer as much heat as quickly as possible. To grind bevels ahead of time would not only slow this down, but make it where the part of the blade which most needs quenching failed to contact the aluminum. So while it's not ideal to be grinding primary bevels into an already hardened blade, it's not really an issue, as even a 60-something HRC is no problem for a zirconia grinding belt. But enough about that. Ta-da! It's a Trollski-style bevel grinding jig. Not gonna freehand this one. Not if I want to match the perfect 90-degree plunge lines of the Vanguard. Copycatting a classic will make you step up your game, and this was one of my favorite ways in which it did. If you're not familiar with a jig like this, the principle is both simple and genius. The screws along the back edge of this angle iron hold the jig at a set angle as it slides across my newly improved tool rest. Meanwhile, the knife, clamped against the upright half of the angle iron, passes along the sanding belt at a likewise consistent angle. If the angle needs adjusting, one only has to add washers and/or nuts to the screws to increase the angle. This leads to perfect symmetry and leaves nothing to chance, which I love. The jig made very short work of beveling down to the line we scribed earlier on the belly. Now I'm just cleaning up the upper half in ricasso by holding the knife simply upright against the belt and platen. This could also be done by simply removing the screws from the jig, but it's very easy to perform by hand. So with that step complete, I swap belts to a 240 grit and go back over everything, primary bevel in the jig and upper half freehand as before. I would usually go a bit finer, but the 240 appeared to be a perfect match to the grinding lines on the Vanguard. So as mentioned earlier, I simply add one nut to each screw to adjust the angle of the jig for the secondary bevel. For this, I just kept the 240 grit belt in place, and it only required a few passes on each side before I had created the most lovely even burr I have ever seen. In fact, before having this jig, I must admit I had never fully understood what a burr actually was. For those like me having had the misconception that it's something invisible to the naked eye, it's actually very visible when you eliminate human error. But without a jig, at least in my case, the burr most often gets knocked off before you get a chance to see it. Now, did I get a close-up of it on video? Well, of course not. I was so pumped when I saw it, I ran straight up to the kitchen, finished it on the sharpening stone, and started cutting things like a madman. Now I'm prepping for the final glue up, and as you can see, I've got the blade nicely taped up with a little extra to account for it being razor sharp, which is usually not the case, but as I said, I couldn't contain my excitement with this one. So here we go, putting in the threaded shaft for the last time. I must say I really love seeing how those split hosel halves just spread open and spring right back into place. To me, it's a real testament for the potential of this steel and what I could do for future projects, like maybe a fillet knife. But I digress. As you saw, I inserted the 2mm brass pin, snipped it off, and yes, the end went flying, and I'll find it somewhere later. Now just hammering down the tips to make a little mini rivet, and look how nicely the threaded shaft still pivots up and down. So rather than epoxy glue, I'm going with Total Boat again. First of all, because it's assured to be compatible with the micarta, since that's what I use to make it. Secondly, it's crystal clear, meaning if it shows up anywhere on the visible exterior, it's going to look like gloss rather than a gross yellow color. And lastly, I've absolutely loved the long 30-minute plus working time I've had with this stuff. It's so great to be doing a glue up and not feel rushed in the slightest. There are literally no drawbacks. Its adhesion qualities and flex are right up there with JB Weld, Loctite, West Systems, and other popular epoxies. So I want to give a shout out to Cole from Wangle's Workshop for first introducing me to Total Boat. If you haven't already discovered Wangle's Workshop on YouTube, you really need to head over and check it out. He has great videos that are loaded with helpful tips and information. Okay, so for this glue up, per protocol, I begin by cleaning everything with acetone, then mixed equal parts of A and B. Don't be fooled by my cropping, you actually need to mix for about 3 to 4 minutes. And I'm actually doing this in 2 stages, basically only gluing up the guard assembly and the front end of the handle to begin with, and here's why. I'm going to be entirely filling the void inside the handle with epoxy before closing up the pommel, and taking into consideration the slow set time, I don't want any of that fill to slowly leak out of any of the tiny openings around the guard assembly. So as you see here, I'm being careful not to get any epoxy on the threaded shaft as I insert it, because I'm going to need to be able to undo the pommel for the second half of the glue up. And to complete this portion, I only put on one of the pommel pieces because that's really all that's needed. And I didn't video it, but I did hold that piece I just screwed on in my vise and gave it another half turn for good measure. Now just wiping off the excess after making sure everything's lined up and in good position, then allowed it to cure for 12 hours. Okay, so now it's 12 hours later, front half is leak proof, and I remove the pommel piece. Drum roll, yes, it's not stuck, shaft still pivots, and now I mix up a second batch of epoxy, this time a bit more, to fill the handle from the back end. Just taking my time, giving it plenty of time to run down and making sure there's no air bubbles, because I want this fill to add strength and lock everything in place. I want to take a minute now to explain why I left the threaded shaft extra long and prefer to allow it to exit out the back of the pommel versus letting it dead end without exiting. So anybody who's ever cut their own threads into metal knows it's a tricky business. If you're tapping threads into a hole that dead ends rather than going all the way through, it had better be a deep hole, especially with a small light duty screw like this. You don't want it just an 1/8 inch deep and holding on by a couple of threads. I once saw an episode of Forged in Fire where this very thing caused the elimination of a contestant. His pommel piece came flying off his weapon as Doug Marcotta was whacking flower pots with it. Secondly, as these shapes on the pommel are oval versus perfectly round, I don't want to be faced with a disaster of them not lining up properly or not tight enough because my shallow hole and brief number of threads dictate it to be so. Obviously, once we're all assembled, I plan to cut off the excess and grind it flush. To me, the faint outline of a circle on the end of a pommel is a small price to pay to assure the best outcome of everything I just described. Who knows, maybe I could even get creative with it later and start stamping a maker's mark or something onto that circle. It's now been another 12 hours and we're ready to grind the handle and pommel to shape. In my experience, micarta is not very ideally workable with hand tools, as the fabric component tends to fray with things like rasp or a file. So while I usually prefer to do this part slowly and carefully by hand, we're going to go with all power tools for this one. You may notice the top half of the pommel is sticking out a bit. That's because it actually ended up turning 180 degrees tighter than I had originally planned due to the lubrication factor of the epoxy. But again, that's why I make these things big, to allow for easy corrections. So to start off with, we're just hitting it with the belt sander to even things up where that part is sticking out. Now I'm just going to use the top roller to start working down those boxy looking edges, taking it down to a more oval shape, but very carefully. And once I felt like I had taken the pommel down to a point where I was only needing fine details, I moved it on over to the 1x30. Again, the small platen and encircling tool rests come in handy. As you'll see here, I was able to reach every single aspect of the handle and guard as I finished bringing them to shape. As you can see, I pretty much already had the guard down to final dimensions prior to the glue up, so it doesn't need much at all. It was only the pommel and its neighboring pieces that remained a big unknown and had to be left so generous, and again, I'm glad I did. Here you get a pretty good look at the faint little circle on the end of the pommel, a mere remnant of my threaded shaft we trimmed off earlier. See, that's not too bad, is it? Now that I'm happy with the shape of everything, from here it's just a matter of polishing. Here I'm bringing everything up to a 120 grit, and yes, I could have just swapped to a 120 on the belt sander, but I'd reached a point where I knew it would be best to slow it down and eliminate the risk of removing too much material. You know, I'm getting really annoyed with how poorly that vise is holding that blade wrapped in soggy masking tape. I've really been wanting to make myself a nice big vise pad out of some vulcanized rubber I've got lying around. In fact, I think this whole dang workbench needs a makeover. Hey, that's more like it. So now that I'm all set up in that nice new vise pad, I'm continuing to polish the handle. Next I took it up to 800 grit and ultimately to 1500 grit. And once I get up around this fine, I usually wet sand with water. I of course left the pommel and guard at a 1500 polish, but on the micarta I ended up going back down to 400 grit because I began to realize that the higher polish I achieved with this black and gray alternation, it became harder and harder to tell the difference between the two colors. Not only that, I feel like if you take micarta up to too fine of a polish, then you start to lose the nice gripping quality that it has. So for this micarta, I arrived at the best combination of looks and good non-slip grip with 400 grit. So as you can see here, we got a nice distinction between the black and gray layers when you don't go too fine. So what do you guys think? Turned out pretty nice, didn't it? Now let's get this edge finished up and have ourselves a little performance test. So it's already pretty sharp straight off the belt sander, but when I want to get hair splitting sharp, I finish it on my two-stage sharpening stone using the coarse then fine stones at 25 degrees. And then just a few light strokes with the finer stone on the 20-degree setting. Okay, looks like paper's no problem. I wonder if I could ever do that trick with the cardboard paper towel roll. Don't we usually have some music here? Yeah, there we go.